Welcome back to Petroleum Economists 2020 LNG to Power Forum for Europe, the Middle East and Africa. We come now to the final panel session of the day, which will address the critical topic of how the investment appetite for gas is changing. As concerns grow over the climate emergency, there are many questions facing the energy industry and particularly the gas industry. In an age of growing ESG concerns, how is the appetite for gas investment changing? Is gas in general, or LNG in particular, a bridge or a destination energy source? What are the real prospects for carbon capture and storage and carbon capture and utilization, which form a central part of many strategies for carbon neutrality, particularly in Europe? And how will attitudes differ in the three regions we're discussing today, Europe, the Middle East and Africa? Before I hand over to our moderator, who is Dr. Carol Bell, founder director of Chapter Zero, I'd just like to say thank you to all of you who've joined us today, the moderators, the panelists, the delegates, and a special thank you to delegates who've interacted with us by asking some fascinating questions. This is the last you'll hear from me today, but I hope to join you again on December the 8th when we have our North American LNG to Power Forum. And now, Carol, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex, for that kind introduction. It's great to be back at a Petroleum Economists conference again, albeit remotely this time, especially to discuss this important question: what is the investment appetite for gas? I'm joined by an excellent panel of speakers, eminently qualified to debate the subject. So may I first introduce them? Rob West is founder of the energy research company Thunderstead Energy, which he established last year with the aim of bringing together the mindset of investment research analysts to evaluating technologies that are reshaping the energy landscape. Rob has done a lot of work on the economics and cost competitiveness of the various technologies that can contribute to decarbonizing energy supply, and we'll look forward to hearing from him. Our second panelist is Professor Erik Bakken, who is the head of analysis at DNV-GL's Global Technology Research Unit for its energy transition program. In addition to his scientific work, Erik is responsible for DNV's energy transition outlook model. Welcome, Erik. And our third and final panelist is Christof Ruehl from Columbia University Center for Global Energy Policy. Christof is an internationally well-known energy economist. Between 2014 and 2018, Christof managed the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority's global research team. And his distinguished CV also includes being Group Chief Economist at BP between 2005 and 2014. So welcome all of you. We have 40 minutes to discuss some pretty weighty matters. And I would ask the audience as well, if they wish to ask questions, we'll try to get to them. And please enter them as per usual. You'll be used to doing that by now today. So perhaps we can start with the position of gas within the energy mix in the quest to reach net zero by 2050. Rob and I contributed to an article Peter Ramsey wrote in the Petroleum Economist in April of last year, whose title asserted, "The world will still need oil and gas for the foreseeable future, but concerns over how much and for how long are stifling investment." Well, I don't need to tell this conference how much the world has changed in the last year and a half, and indeed how much the profile of ESG has risen and concerns for climate change as well. So could I ask the panel now whether they see appetite for investing in new gas resources today, and what the prospects are for gas within the total energy mix over time as we look out towards 2050. So Christof, may I ask you to start with this, please?
Thank you very much. So that is a very good and very important question. I want to approach it from two different angles. But let me say first a few words about the energy mix. We have a global energy mix in which gas is rising the fastest for the last 10 or 15 years or so of all the primary fuels. Is now close to about 30%, but it's only number two. The biggest one is still oil. We also have a global energy mix, very important, where all the fuels are growing in absolute terms. Yeah? So the global energy system has been, people have been talked since time immemorial of peak oil and peak coal and peak everything else, but it has never happened. Energy demand was so vibrant all along that every single primary fuel, renewables or fossil fuels, is growing, continues to grow. We have a bit of a stutter now in coal and in nuclear, but nothing to do with supply constraints. And jury's still out whether that continues. So within that spectre, gas is on a rapid expansion course. The speed of which its share increases and therefore its growth rate is beaten only by the renewables, who start from a much lower base, of course. And gas used to have this one very big advantage, which came under the name of bridge fuel, which is really that one said, okay, most of gas today goes into power generation, and the emissions, as you all know, from gas and power are about 50% of the emissions of coal and power, and so it's a no-brainer for this very fast-growing, especially developing countries, emerging markets, who drive this expansion of the entire energy system, of which I had spoken earlier, to replace coal with gas. And yes, there was a bit of an opposition, so some hardcore environmentalist extremists really who said gas is bad because it's also carbon, but that was a minority position. So that seemed to be a pretty strong incentive. Now gas has come under pressure from two different ends. It's like bookended by, not yet between a rock and a hard place, but it has come under more pressure. The first one is that this neat line that gas is cleaner than coal and therefore a good bridge fuel and doesn't compete with oil in power generation, so therefore an ideal bridge fuel, is coming under attack. And the reason is the methane gas emissions, which we see everywhere. We are so used, especially in the energy world, of talking about climate change always in connection with CO2 emissions, that we forget that there's a whole bundle of greenhouse gas emissions, different gases, and the second biggest after CO2 is methane. I don't never know how to pronounce it. And the point here is that they have very different characteristics. CO2 is accumulating in the atmosphere and staying up there hundreds of years for a very long term. And we have a carbon budget and know that the next 20 years it will be filled, but it isn't quite overflowing yet. Methane is different because that stays in the atmosphere about 10 years and the climate effects are immediate. So if we are now complaining about bushfires in California and rising ocean levels and all things happening today, then either we're chasing something which is just in our imagination, or if it's correct, it's methane to some large extent. And consequently, starting in the US, we have a big discussion around methane gas emissions, because methane occurs in the production of fossil fuels, but also by flaring when people are chasing oil. And it occurs and have associated gas, which they don't need, and it occurs in transport and in LNG and in projects like that. So that is one big problem, which is something investors coming to our theme are wary of. And I would think that when we talk about gas investments, it will become a bigger topic to make sure that they can make the credible claim that methane emissions are under control. Because of course we live in a world where you have satellite surveillance, all these kind of things, and it gets more and more into the headlines, and it becomes more and more difficult to hide if you're not a country like North Korea or Russia, where you don't open up. The second side from which gas comes a little bit under pressure is the energy transition and the call for renewables. And here, what we have is an effect now from the pandemic, which is sort of, I think, ill understood a little bit. So I wanted to spend half a minute on that as well. So we have the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course it was an enormous hit to energy demand in general. The biggest hit is taken by transport fuels, by oil. Electricity has suffered much less. In industrial countries, about 6 or 7% down during the first period of the lockdown. So this time around in the second wave, it will be less. Simply because when people work from home, then the demand for electricity doesn't disappear. They use the computers they would have used in the office, otherwise they switch on the light and all of that. So it was a relatively moderate impact. But the big question is not, this 7%, 6% temporary decline. The big question is, will this pandemic bring forward a bigger shift toward renewables and away from fossil fuels, including natural gas? And the answer is probably not. I know most people would disagree at this point. Most people think that the pandemic accelerates developments towards green energy because of all these government programs. But if you step back and you look at it sort of calmly, the situation, then this pandemic in the competition of natural gas with renewables had three effects. Number one, it lowered the price of all fossil fuels. Oil prices, coal prices, gas prices, they all are lower. Gas prices have recovered to some extent, but they have been low before. And so that's bad. That has to be bad for the energy transition because the relative price of the fossil competition has gone down. So renewables get relatively more expensive, subsidies get higher, and so on and so forth. That's a negative. Number two, the pandemic globally has hit our economies very hard. That's also a negative because renewables and clean energy doesn't come about like coal did or like oil did when they took over the energy system because of superior economics. They come about because of a change in our preferences. They are expensive. They are often subsidized. So if societies have less money, there's less money for the energy transition. And the third point is the pandemic also has given rise to extraordinary and really unprecedented government programs to support the economy and to support people who lost their jobs and so on. These things we all know about. That is a mixed result. It could be good for the energy transition if it's a country rich enough and the population engaged enough to demand that it is spent on a green stimulus. But in most countries, that's not the case. It is definitely the case in Europe, where we have seen a big and very green stimulus package. In the US, the jury is out. I mean, depends on what happens today. If Trump wins, forget it. If Biden wins, it will be a green stimulus package. And with some modifications, maybe in Korea, Japan, isolated countries in Asia. But by and large, it's a mixed bag. And where most people sit and where most of the growth in energy takes place in India and China, in the small countries in between the emerging markets, we have not seen yet a big green stimulus. We've seen talk about decarbonization, but no action. So stepping back, and when I said, where's the role of gas in the energy mix? It's a growing system. Gas grows faster than others. It has come under pressure now from more scrutiny and more knowledge about what greenhouse gas emissions actually are. And it turns out it isn't all that clean as it claimed to be compared to the other fossil fuels. It should come under pressure, many people say, from stimulus programs and green programs and government support for renewables, replacing gas or reducing it to a backup generator or something. But that hasn't really happened yet, and gas there is very able to compete and stand its ground. That's the initial position. And then the consequences, I think, for investing are pretty straightforward from there.
Well, thank you, Christof. That's a very encyclopedic introduction to this topic. Could I turn to you now, Rob, and see how you see gas, let's say 20 years from now, within the energy mix?
Well, at the risk of giving a controversial answer, look, I've built models of how we can decarbonize the world twice over. We have the luxury that we only need to decarbonize the world once over. And in the lowest cost way I can get net zero energy by 2050, we're going to treble the demand for natural gas. We're going to have 400 TCF of gas in this energy system. And I guess what I should do is unpack that a little bit, because it probably deserves to be unpacked. So if you take the energy system today, it's 70,000 terawatt hours per year across all of mankind. I like to think about that. It's like a kitchen toaster running 24 hours a day, 365 days a year for every man, woman, and child on the planet. By 2050, the world's going to go from 7.8 billion people to about 9.5 billion people. And in the emerging world, we're going to go from using about a quarter as much energy as in the developed world to about a third as much energy as in the developed world. And you further those two things through, and we end up with an energy system that's 120,000 terawatt hours per year. The reason that number matters is because wind and solar are currently going at a combined rate of about 300 terawatt hours per annum. We're scaling up wind and solar at this vast rate of 300 terawatt hours per annum, but it's got to build into 120,000 terawatt hour per year energy system. And so that leaves a room where you're going to need other fuels. Gas meets a lot of that need in our models for the following reason. When you generate a megawatt hour of power from coal, you emit 1 ton of CO2. When you generate a megawatt hour of power from gas, and you get it right, and you don't leak the methane, as Christof said, then you only have 350 kilograms of CO2. So these are the two big reasons that gas demand goes up on our models. But there's a lot more. There's a lot more, and it's technology. And I know I can bore for Britain on this topic, but I'd like to give you some examples here. The first example I'd like to give you is some of these hydrogen technologies. One of the largest sources of growth for gas is, creating blue hydrogen. I think green hydrogen is a bubble. The economics don't come anywhere close to working. They never will. Blue hydrogen is going to be able to deliver large amounts of usable heat and power at about $1.45 a kilogram to make a 10% return. And here's the thing, this is a dream for the gas industry, because you get to sell about 20% more gas when you make it into hydrogen first, because these autothermal reformers are only about 75% efficient. The next component is, when you actually try and build integrated models, combining all these different energy transition technologies, you end up, even in a mature market like Europe, with gas demand growing over 1% a year to basically a new peak in 2030. And when I say this, what I'm referring to, is this. Let's say we're going to try and build an actual functioning model of all the following. We're going to scale up renewables at their fastest rate. They're going to keep growing at that fast rate. We're going to phase out 50% of coal because it's dirty. We're going to turn down nuclear because apparently people don't like nuclear. We're going to get 20% of all the vehicle miles by 2030 driven by electric vehicles. We're going to take shipping fuels and continue making them cleaner, which involves some shipping fuels shifting to gas. And you model these things and actually put them in a bridge. And I am going to end up in a gas market in Europe where we have to double the amount of LNG we're importing between now and 2030. And I think the biggest thing that scares me, doing a lot of consulting work with policymakers, including in the US on both sides of the aisle, is there's a lot of people who just aren't looking at the numbers. And you get a lot of hype, you get a lot of misinformation, you get a lot of spin. But when you build these models, where you end up is that gas demand is going to go higher. And actually, I think the biggest thing I'm worried about is that a lot of these targets are going to have to be walked back because we're not going to have enough gas to meet these targets. The final thing I wanted to say, Carol, is on how can it be? So, I guess I said at the start, how can it be that you can build a functioning energy system by 2050 with 400 TCF a year of gas, and you can call this a fully decarbonized energy system? And the answer is because of carbon capture and carbon offsets. Now, carbon capture is kind of the rationale for blue hydrogen. The cheapest way I can do carbon capture at scale is to combine it with blue hydrogen and get the benefits of scale and the disposal and the pipes. Yeah. But I also got nature-based solutions in here. I'm just going to say 30 seconds on this. The single largest source of CO2 emissions on the planet is deforestation. If you were to rank all the sources of CO2 emissions, 10 billion tons a year would come from the deforestation of the destruction of nature. That's more than all of China. That's more than all the world's passenger cars. And in our numbers of how we get to net zero, we involve, well, one, ceasing to destroy nature, and two, reforesting something like 3 billion acres of the world. And that will buy us a carbon budget where those incremental forests offset about 15 billion tons a year of CO2. And the reason this is important is this is the lowest cost decarbonisation on the planet. The CO2 price here is about $3 to $10 a ton. This is not green hydrogen with an abatement cost of $700 a ton. This is real. Personally, I offset all my emissions 10 times over by buying nature-based carbon credits. And this is going to be combined with natural gas to yield a fuel called decarbonised gas. And I'm going to stop here, but this is the largest opportunity for decarbonised natural gas.
I'm sure we'll come back to some of the points on hydrogen later on, Rob, and carbon capture and storage as well. But you tied in very nicely there to what Christof said about the affordability of what lies ahead, given the pandemic and given the massive hit that the world economy has taken in 2020. I want to bring in Erik as our technical expert and as a scientist here. What have you heard from Christof and Rob, Erik, that resonates with you, and how would you enlarge on it perhaps with your technical bent?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very happy to try to do that. First, I totally agree with Christof that the pandemic, of course, matters. But our analysis is also that it won't really help the transition. There are a lot of things that are happening that are furthering green energy solutions, but equally well, there are things and government actions that will benefit fossil fuels. So I totally agree with him there. On the energy future, I must say that our analysis is slightly different from what we've heard so far. We have over the past 4 years issued what we call the Energy Transition Outlook, and we are an organization with 12,000 people, and about 4,000 people of our colleagues work in power and renewables, and 4,000 people work in oil and gas. So we are, we are on both sides of that aisle of fossil and non-fossil fuels. And when it comes to gas, we see that gas use globally will increase by about 1/3 to 2035, but then it will peak. When it comes to Europe, in our analysis, we are already beyond the peak. We see that European gas demand will stay at current levels for a little more than a decade before it actually declines by about 1/3 to 2050. So our analysis is that the electricity demand globally, of course, will increase a lot, and of course that will benefit for the next couple of decades gas, because that is a very good fuel. But when you come to the mid-30s, the cost advantage of variable renewables will be so that they will eat into the power markets, and we will see that gas use for power in 2050 will only be at 40% of current levels. But of course, that is the sector that we will see most hard hit when it comes to gas. When we look at hard to abate industry, the gas use in 2050 will remain at 85% of current levels. And another hard to abate sector is heavy transport. And to take shipping here, gas will actually crowd out oil to 2040, taking half of the fuel market share. And thereafter, hydrogen will ensure gases, the sum of hydrogen, ammonia, and natural gas will fuel 95% of all shipping. And half of the hydrogen will be blue hydrogen. So this is sort of the general picture we see, where strong gas growth globally for the next 15 years, but in Europe, it has already peaked. When it comes to technologies, of course, we see that hydrogen with CCS will afford blue hydrogen, covering about half the total hydrogen use in 2050. So I totally agree with the analysis that at least currently, green hydrogen is not up to the task. It is too expensive, and it will take a long time before it reaches 50% market share. So that is electrolysis. That is blue hydrogen. Of course, blue hydrogen means that you put carbon capture and storage on top. We see carbon capture and storage taking off, but not within the first 10 years. Next to me here, at the outskirts of Oslo, we are building already a new CCS plant, putting 2.5 billion British pounds into that, of government money mostly. But why does the government do this? Because we see that is an extremely fast-growing global market when we come a decade or so into the future. So finally, on technology, renewable technology will continue its cost decline, both when it comes to solar PV, when it comes to wind, In particular, we see that floating offshore wind today prohibitively expensive and needing a lot of public support, government support. When we come 20 years into the future, that will have a cost very close to all kinds of wind, which will be very low. So of course, a future variable renewable energy system will need a lot of flexibility options, and we see technology affording demand response to supply part of that flexibility, but also batteries will continue to be developed and decrease in costs. And of course, on the other side, we see vehicle to grid systems where electric vehicles are connected to the grid, and our assumption, our analysis, as 10% of all these battery fueled vehicles will be connected to the grid at any given point in time, and that will create a lot of flexibility for the power system. So in our analysis, the technology is favoring renewable energy, and there's a lot of gas growth over the next decade and a half, but thereafter there will be not crowded out, because there is a play between variable renewable and gas also for peaking capacity, but in general we see a less role for gas in 2050 than today.
Well, thank you very much. That's a very interesting point of view, and I'm very familiar with that report to which you refer from DNV, which is a very helpful report to chart the movement in these technologies. I think we've probably dealt with the question that it's not enough that gas isn't oil and that it's not coal either. Can we explore a little bit further whether we think gas is a bridge here or a destination? You know, are we moving away from it being a bridge? Are we moving into having gas as part of a different segment of the energy sector? And maybe if I could go back to Erik on that.
Yes. Yeah. So in our analysis, there will be use for gas in blue hydrogen. So that is probably a permanent solution, but at very different and much lower levels than today. So that is one permanent future use of gas. On top of that, there is a need for gas to balance the variable renewable. That is also a permanent use of gas, and that will be made carbon neutral either by CCS in bigger power plants, or as mentioned by Rob, by other sequestration technologies. We are also looking into something not discussed earlier today, but that is use of seaweed as and kelp as underwater repositories for carbon. You might remember that there is as much carbon being sequestrated by sea plants as land plants. So there's a huge potential there.
I mean, I would say it's a destination, and the reason I think that, and I think this is so important, is cost. Cost. I can build models of, I could come to your house and I can decarbonize your household heating bill in 10 different ways. Which one do you want to choose? Well, if you have an efficient natural gas boiler and you bundle that natural gas with some nature-based solutions, I could decarbonize your entire household heating bill for about $50 per household per year. You know, every MCF of gas is going to emit 53 kilograms of CO2, and we take that amount of gas, and for every MCF we need to plant a certain number of trees, $3 to $10 a ton. I can go and build you a blue hydrogen heating system for your house, and it's going to increase your household heating bill by $1,000. I can come and build you a green hydrogen heating system for your house. It's going to increase your household heating bill for $3,000. And I think that, you know, I can take your house and I can power it all with renewables. It's also going to cost about $3,000. And I think this is important because household heating is 7% of total CO2. So we can't blow all of our budget, and I just want to put this in perspective. The average income in the developed world is $30,000 per person per year. I mean, if you do numbers where you're going to be paying $15 a kilogram for green hydrogen, and you're going to power an entire person's energy needs in a year by green hydrogen, it would absorb $30,000 a year. It would absorb their entire income. And we look back at these bubbles in history, like the Dutch tulip bubble, and we say, isn't it ridiculous? Tulip bulbs were trading at 10 times the average income of a person. And I'm looking at some of these energy technologies and building cost models, and it's the same. And look, we could go into a lot of details here. I mean, like I said, I could bore for Britain on these models and these numbers, but I have to think common sense is going to prevail, and people are going to decide that they prefer low-cost decarbonisation over high-cost decarbonisation. And if you want that, then you're going to end up with a lot more gas than I think some of the forecasts I see from sort of consensus out there. And so that's the thing I would watch.
Could I just bring in a question from the floor here, where Dexter Crow has asked a question about CCS. Is it part of the solution or a myth? Which is something that I was going to come on to a bit later on. Erik mentioned the plant that's being built outside Oslo. But this question has a UK-centric feel. It's oft talked about, but all the global demonstrator projects are only tiny scale pilots. Is it for real? Will it really come in a reasonable timescale? I guess the Norwegian government is putting its money where its mouth is already on this matter. Rob, can I start with you and then I'll go on to Christof?
Well, I've done some detailed models around this, and it's all about scale. So you can get a CCS value chain to work at about $70 a ton. That's about 50, and just to give you the context, my roadmap of how you decarbonize the whole world, we decarbonize the whole world with a CO2 price of $75 a ton, so 5% of the average developed world income. How do we get to $70 a ton for CCS? Well, it's about 50 for the amine process that separates out the CO2 from the exhaust gas. It's about $5 to $10 a ton for the big pipe that transport the CO2 to a disposal site, and it's about $10 to $20 a ton for the disposal. However, and the really important thing is this is for a multi-million ton per year CO2 disposal facility, taking CO2 out of a high concentration exhaust stream, 50, 60% CO2 in that exhaust stream. Problem. If you're trying to capture the CO2 from a natural gas plant, you've got about 4% CO2 in the exhaust. So your carbon capture costs start going up by 30 to 40%. If you're doing it at a couple 100,000 tons a year, the pipes don't get to amortize their costs over as much CO2. The disposal facilities, they're the same, but they don't really get to amortize their costs over as much CO2. And you end up with numbers that quickly get to around $300 a ton if you're trying to do CCS at a small scale facility. And this is why you end up being, becoming a convert to blue hydrogen. It's because if you build a big blue hydrogen plant, you take that CH4 molecule, you split it into CO2 and H2 at one giant multi-million ton per year plant. All of the carbon goes straight into a big pipe, into a big disposal facility. You get your disposal away for $20 a ton, and that hydrogen can go and decarbonize lots of other stuff. And that ends up with a value chain between $100 and $200 a ton, depending on how you build it. So you end up being cheaper than doing CCS on, the boiler in your house, going back to my household heating example. So that's why I think if you want to get bullish on CCS, weirdly, you end up getting bullish on blue hydrogen instead.
That's a very interesting connection. Christof, could I bring you in at this point?
Yeah, so let me try to connect these things in a sensible way. The first one, I'm always, and this sounds like a detour, but it's not. I want to re-emphasize something Robert said. It is very, very, very unlikely, it's impossible almost, that we get anywhere close to the Paris targets. The situation is very bad, and it is all the things he said and worse. When you want to support economic growth and so on, you will have carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions, which make the Paris targets impossible to reach. And so I'm very happy. This is something I'm preaching for a long time when I hear other people saying that, because it is time for a dose of realism. If people don't realize how big a problem it is, then all we will earn is cynicism at the moment they find out it can't be solved overnight. So kudos to that. But then the danger is, of course, that everybody then just goes down in his little garden and with his pet projects. So when I look at the scale of that problem, the first thing which comes to mind is that most of us are still talking too much about abatement, about how to prevent releasing carbon into the atmosphere or greenhouse gases again. That is not going to do the trick. So we will also have to talk about how we get it out of the atmosphere. That's where the CCS question is coming in. We will not get it out of the atmosphere by carbon capture and storage. You know, it's not a new technology. These are an old technology. And I remember very well when I was working in the oil industry. It's clumsy, it's expensive, and it basically makes sense only where you produce oil and gas. Everywhere else, you will see people running riot and protesting it, and it hasn't been a great success. And it's not like Rob says there, I have to disagree with him, that you build some huge, big, super plant and then you can solve it. No, in order to get carbon out of the atmosphere to help us getting anywhere close with Paris targets, so we will need to have offsets. So you have a carbon price, and then you have somebody building forests and sinks for carbon and selling these permits. The problem with this is, this has been tried once in the ETS system in Europe and has probably been the biggest fraudulent financial markets that I've ever seen. And I think if that takes place at scale, that is just an open invitation to fraud. I mean, this permit trading is so that's going to be a very tough uphill battle for the energy transition. But this and not CCS will be the solution. So if somebody wants to do something useful, lawyers, economists, business people try to work out a regulatory framework where global governance can do that. This is actually should be easier than a carbon tax, because this at the end of the day, these are markets, financial markets, and a network of international financial markets is easier to connect than having a common target. So the next point, because of the scale of the problem and because of the impossibility to fix it with a one-size-fits-all solution, there will be no, I don't see gas peaking. It's funny because I was just today completing a paper on that the numbers seem to suggest that there's a peak in oil demand coming, and probably has been with us already in 2019. But for gas, it's an incomparably different situation. And when you think about the growth which is necessary just in power generation, and that the only sensible alternative to gas is coal in many places, because renewables are too expensive and still have the intermittency problem, then you know that gas will not sort of peak and disappear pretty fast. And the hydrogen fat at the moment will just add to this. But I want to get somewhere else with this last point. The biggest problem in the energy transition problem, I shouldn't even say that, but the biggest concern is a country called China. China has given itself just a target, and they say they want to decarbonize by 2060, and everybody scratches his head and wonders how they will do this. China, however, is also the country which has the biggest proved shale gas reserves in the world. It's not the US, it's China. Why did they, and at the same time, you talk about the energy mix, natural gas in the Chinese energy mix is maybe 7%. So why this disconnect? And the answer is a very simple one, that historically it was just cheaper and faster to build up the industrial base China's development program needed with coal. But in the future, this may have changed. They have not cracked the nut about shale production yet. Why not? Because when we go and we look at what happens in the US, there's one simple lesson, which is that you let 1,000 flowers bloom. Competition is what drove the shale boom. It wasn't the big guys, with a planned, careful investment of Exxon and Shell and BP. These were wildcatters, small guys who developed this technology because they were running after the promising profit because oil prices were high. It was a very Schumpeterian process there. The Chinese have parceled out the most prospective regions to their 3 to 5, depending who's counting, state-owned energy companies who don't really have a big incentive because gas prices are too low and competition is not really happening inside China with these pre-assigned areas, so they just follow orders. And surprise, surprise, have not succeeded yet in any kind of scale. But it's not, and I think that's a very important point, and then I shut up, it's not a matter of, no water, shale gas too deep, infrastructure not there. that can be fixed and has always been fixed in the history of this industry. It's a matter of poor regulation and the wrong incentives and the wrong development model for it. An old centrally planned move will not get us there. The Russians have tried that, the Soviet Union has tried it, didn't succeed with it. And that means China being China, they will correct it eventually. And that is where a big boost will come from for the world, when this country turns away from coal. And that will change the global fuel mix and will give us sort of a longer lease on life in this whole endeavor, I think. That's something.
Christof, we're sort of coming towards the end of our session and how quickly it's gone. And your comments there about China are a neat segue into where I wanted to end up, actually, which is, do we discern different attitudes in different parts of the world towards investing in gas at present? Gas is relatively ubiquitous, but how do we feel as a panel about the availability of capital to develop resources in order to play the part that we've bottomed out for gas globally over the next decades? Christof, maybe I'll start with you again on this. Do you see a difference between the Middle East and Europe and Africa? Obviously, there's an ESG component in Europe that is not there maybe to the same degree in other countries.
So when you think about investing gas or otherwise, but also gas, then it brings you back to the ground floor pretty fast, because then what matters is profitability, and that's what drives gas investment around the world. And so there you live in very different environments. You have sort of declining indigenous production in Europe. That's not an issue. And next door in Russia, you have a pretty highly scaled effort to not only continue to deliver pipeline gas into Europe and China in the east, but also to scale up and to compete in global LNG markets. And with things like electronic trading platforms where Gazprom massively moves away from the oil indexation, so all sorts of things to become and to stay a leading gas exporter and to bite the bullet of flexibility if need be. Then in the US, you have now a bubble which has burst, and this was all this gas, which was associated gas and actually carried a negative price, so that most investments haven't taken place in gas exploitation anymore, except some of the super majors came slightly late to the shale boom. But most investments have taken place into infrastructure for LNG exports. And even that is now taking a hit with projects being postponed. And so this is a case where gas prices are very low and just too much gas comes out of everybody's ears. So don't expect too much there. And I know people, they're working in the gas business and thinking about investing there. They are all in cost-cutting mode, full stop. They have seen now years of excess gas and very low prices, and they have seen increasingly the difficulty competing at their prices internationally. And so that's being scaled down. And then China we touched about, and Asia we touched about, that is going to come at some point. Last item on this list, probably the Middle East. And the Middle East has a different problem, which is that they, especially Saudi Arabia, continue to burn an enormous amount of crude oil in order to produce their power. Middle East is the only region in the world where energy intensity increases and not decreases. And a lot of that is crude oil being burned for power. And countries now increasingly have tried to switch to natural gas. They try to also have some projects like big solar farms in the desert and all of that, for which you could use gas as a bridge fuel. But these projects have not really taken up. There's a lot of talk. But when you drive around in Abu Dhabi or Riyadh or Saudi Arabia, there's no solar panels on anybody's roof. And the big farms in the desert are not operational yet. But they do produce gas in the hope eventually to join the club like Qatar of LNG exporters, but also because it's such a completely irrational region. You have Kuwait getting LNG imports from Norway or from Australia sometimes. Next door in Iraq, you have this giant flaring of gas.
Yeah.
So they try to rationalize that system, again, driven by economics, not by climate change. And the economics here are to replace crude oil under the boiler because it's too expensive.
Well, the time has gone so quickly. Thank you all very much. I think we have to draw the session to a close. I would just say on a personal note, I would love to sit on a board with the three of you in order to formulate the perfect energy company to navigate what lies ahead.
Let's make it happen, Carol.
Pardon? Well,
let's make it happen.
That could be an idea. That could be an idea. Next time I'm in Oslo, I'll call in with Erik and hopefully meet Christof in person as well. But thank you all for the tremendous insight you've given and the data that you've transferred to our audience as well. I'm sure that's been very meaningful because a number of people are grappling with the interplay of these different strands in the energy transition. So thank you very, very much indeed. And it leaves, I'm left to draw the conference to a close. I hope everybody's had a tremendous day at this conference. It's always a great pleasure for me, and I'm sure our other speakers, to participate with Petroleum Economists. And I wish everybody the best, and I hope that we will all meet in person in future years to discuss this topic, which is certainly not going away. Thank you very much indeed.